Fide. Right now, there's a good chance you've seen someone smoke weed. Maybe you've tried it yourself. Maybe you've smelled it drifting through a neighborhood, past a dispensary on your way to work, Fide, or heard someone argue that it's either a dangerous drug or a harmless plant. Whatever your opinion is, cannabis feels like a modern topic, something tied to politics, medicine, or recent culture, Fide. But what if I told you that humans were using cannabis thousands of years before the first city existed? Long before countries debated whether it should be legal. Long before people knew what THC was, Fide. Long before anyone had written down a single word. In fact, the story of cannabis begins before anyone smoked it at all. It starts with a wild plant growing across the vast grasslands of Central Asia. Fide. A plant that humans probably ignored for thousands of years because at first glance it didn't look very useful. It wasn't especially tasty. It wasn't colorful. It didn't produce large fruit. Yet somehow, Fide, this ordinary-looking weed ended up traveling with humans across nearly every continent on Earth. The question is, why? For a long time, archaeologists assumed cannabis became important because of its fibers, Fide. Its stalks could be turned into incredibly strong rope and cloth. Before steel cables or synthetic materials, hemp was one of the strongest natural fibers people had ever discovered, Fide. Some of the oldest evidence comes from ancient China nearly 12,000 years ago. Impressions of hemp fibers have been found pressed into early pottery, suggesting people were already weaving the plant into baskets, fishing nets, Fide, and clothing. At this point, there is no evidence anyone was smoking it. Cannabis wasn't a drug, it was a tool, but humans have always been curious. Once you spend enough time around a plant, Fide, you begin to notice everything about it. How it smells, how it burns, how animals react to it, which varieties are different from others. Somewhere along the way, someone discovered there was more to cannabis than rope, Fide. Exactly when that happened remained a mystery for decades. Then archaeologists climbed into the mountains. In 2019, an international team of researchers published findings from an ancient cemetery high in the Pamir Mountains, Fide, along what would later become part of the Silk Road. The site, known as Jerzankel Cemetery, sits over 3,000 meters above sea level in what is now western China. Inside several wooden braziers, Fide, they found blackened stones that had clearly been heated during ancient ceremonies. That wasn't surprising. What was surprising was what those stones contained. Using chemical analysis, Fide, scientists detected residues of cannabinoids, the chemical compounds naturally found in cannabis. More importantly, they found unusually high levels of THC, the psychoactive compound responsible for cannabis's intoxicating effects. Fide. The braziers were around 2,500 years old. This is the oldest direct evidence we have that humans were deliberately inhaling cannabis smoke. Think about that. For thousands of years, Fide, cannabis had been useful for making rope and fabric. Then suddenly we find people intentionally burning stronger varieties during what appear to have been ritual ceremonies. Something changed. But here's the interesting part, Fide. The cannabis growing naturally across much of the ancient world probably didn't contain especially high amounts of THC. Wild cannabis is often much less potent than the carefully bred plants people use today, Fide. So why did these ancient people have stronger cannabis? One possibility is that they found it by accident. High-altitude environments expose plants to harsher sunlight and greater ultraviolet radiation. Some botanists believe these stressful conditions may have encouraged certain cannabis plants to produce higher concentrations of psychoactive compounds. If travelers noticed that mountain cannabis had unusual effects, they may have started seeking it out intentionally. Another possibility is even more remarkable. Humans may have been selectively choosing stronger plants without understanding the chemistry behind them. Generation after generation, they simply kept the plants that produced the most noticeable effects, not because they knew about THC, because they knew how those plants made people feel. This wouldn't be the first time humans unknowingly changed an entire species. We did the same thing with wolves, eventually creating dogs. We did it with wild grasses, eventually creating wheat. We did it with tiny jungle fruits, eventually producing modern bananas. Humans have been shaping nature long before we understood genetics. Cannabis may have been another example, but why smoke it in the first place? To answer that, we have to understand something about ancient life. For most of human history, survival consumed nearly every waking hour, finding food, avoiding predators, raising children, traveling enormous distances. Life rarely offered opportunities to step outside ordinary reality, yet nearly every civilization eventually discovered ways to do exactly that. Some fermented fruit into alcohol, others chewed stimulating leaves. Others brewed powerful teas, again and again across different continents and different cultures. Humans searched for plants that changed the way the mind experienced the world. Cannabis appears to have become one of those plants. Not simply because people wanted to feel good, but because altered states often became part of religion. Ancient rituals frequently involved music, fire, dancing, chanting, and substances capable of changing perception. To modern eyes, these ceremonies can seem mysterious, but to ancient communities, they may have served an important purpose. Shared experiences strengthened social bonds, they reinforced traditions, they connected generations. And for some people, they may have felt like conversations with the spiritual world itself. The Greek historian Herodotus described one remarkable example over 2,400 years ago. Writing about the nomadic Scythians who lived across the Eurasian steppe, he claimed they would throw cannabis seeds onto heated stones inside enclosed tents, as thick clouds of smoke filled the space. The participants shouted with joy. For centuries, historians weren't sure whether to believe him. Ancient writers sometimes exaggerated unfamiliar cultures. Then archaeology caught up. Burials associated with the Scythians have uncovered cannabis remains, ceremonial equipment, and evidence consistent with smoke rituals remarkably similar to what Herodotus described. Sometimes history turns out to be more accurate than we expect. As trade routes expanded across Asia, cannabis traveled with them. Merchants carried seeds, migrating communities introduced it to new regions. Over centuries, the same plant acquired completely different meanings depending on where it arrived. In some places, it remained primarily an industrial crop. In others, it became medicine. Elsewhere, it became sacred. Ancient Chinese medical texts describe cannabis preparations for treating pain and other illnesses. Indian traditions eventually connected cannabis with the worship of the god Shiva, and preparations made from the plant became part of certain religious festivals and ceremonies. One plant, dozens of cultures, entirely different purposes. That's something humans do surprisingly often. Coffee began as a regional plant before becoming a global habit. Tea spread across continents and transformed entire economies. Tobacco followed trade routes until it reached nearly every corner of the world. Cannabis followed a similar path. Every society adapted it to its own beliefs. Then came another twist. For much of history, cannabis wasn't controversial. It was simply another useful plant. Farmers grew hemp. Sailors depended on hemp rope to keep ships together. Paper, clothing, fishing nets, bowstrings, sacks. Hemp quietly supported countless parts of everyday life. In fact, before synthetic fibers existed, many civilizations would have struggled without it. That's easy to forget today because modern conversations focus almost entirely on smoking. For thousands of years, smoking was only one chapter in a much larger story. Then science finally began explaining what ancient people could only experience. In the 20th century, researchers isolated THC and discovered the endocannabinoid system, a network of receptors found throughout the human body and brain. Suddenly, something astonishing became clear. Humans didn't evolve receptors because cannabis existed. Those receptors were already there. They help regulate memory, mood, appetite, pain, sleep, and many other essential functions. Cannabis simply happens to interact with a system our bodies already possess. It's one of those strange moments where evolution and biology seem to fit together almost too neatly. The people sitting around those ancient braziers had no idea any of this was happening. They couldn't explain neurotransmitters. They couldn't measure cannabinoids. They didn't know what receptors were. They only knew the experience. Sometimes human history works like that. We discover something useful first. We understand why much later. So when did humans first start smoking weed? Based on the evidence we have today, the oldest direct proof points to ritual ceremonies around 2,500 years ago in the mountains of Central Asia. But the story almost certainly didn't begin there. People rarely invent complex traditions overnight. By the time something appears in the archaeological record, it has often existed for generations, or even centuries. Somewhere, long before those braziers were placed among the graves, someone probably tossed cannabis onto a fire. Maybe they noticed the unusual smell. Maybe they breathed in the smoke by accident. Maybe they liked what happened. Then they told someone else. That simple moment may have started a tradition that eventually crossed continents. Today, cannabis is grown legally in some countries, banned in others, prescribed as medicine, debated in politics, and studied in laboratories. People still argue about its risks, its benefits, its place in society. Those debates will probably continue for years. But one thing is much harder to argue with. For thousands of years, humans have had an unusual relationship with this plant. Not because it was fashionable, not because of modern culture, but because generation after generation found something about it worth preserving. The laws changed, the names changed, the methods changed, but the curiosity remained the same. Just like the people who brewed beer in caves before agriculture or gathered around ancient fires beneath unfamiliar stars, someone, somewhere, looked at an ordinary plant and wondered what would happen if they tried it. That question became part of human history, and every conversation about cannabis today is, in one way or another, a continuation of one that may have started thousands of years ago around a small fire in the mountains, with smoke rising quietly into the night sky.